Chloe, thank you so much for being here. I am going to embarrass you and read through your bio. Try not to flatter you too much. So, Chloe Zachary completed her undergraduate degree with honors in psychology from Georgetown University and her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She's a local. While in graduate school, Dr. Zachary obtained expertise in behavioral parent training and conducted extensive research on the role of parental emotion on child behavior. Dr. Zachary completed her 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in DBT at the Triangle Area Psychology Clinic, also known as the TAP Clinic, where she currently practices full-time. She obtained an individual certification in DBT by the Linehan Board of Certification, and she also started and leads the SPACE program at TAP for caregivers of anxious youth. Chloe, thank you so much for being here. I will turn it over to you. And yeah, just give me a shout if you need anything.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you all for having me. All right, so I will just dive in and feel free to jump in with questions, or will leave time for questions at the end. I will probably not be watching the chat while I talk, just because I'm not good at multitasking. But my goal today is to give you all an overview of what space treatment is, a taste for some of kind of the big pieces of it, and some of the rationale that is behind it. So I realized that I didn't include a ton on what SPACE actually stands for. So let me just dive into that right now. So SPACE is supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions. It's a lovely acronym. And so this is an evidence-based treatment that was designed out of the Yale Child Study Center. And it is a entirely caregiver-based treatment that has an evidence for reducing child. And when we say child throughout this entire talk, I am using that term loosely in the sense that this could be an adult child as well. But most of the research is with young adults through young kids. And the nice thing is that it has shown to be kind of have equivalent effect sizes in terms of treatment outcomes for youth anxiety, but it entirely works through caregivers. So that is a little bit about SPACE, and we'll just dive right in. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the basics of anxiety because I'm going to assume that a lot of us are familiar with them, but just kind of a reminder that anxiety is this emotion that we are hardwired to feel. It is effective and functional when it motivates us to fight, flee, or freeze when faced with a physical threat to our safety. But it often gets co-opted, and in the case of OCD, it is commonly firing when the evidence really doesn't fit the facts. Also, just name that we talk a lot. I'm going to talk a lot about this in anxiety, but OCD often includes other emotions such as guilt, shame, disgust that can get wrapped up in there. So some of the common components that we see in anxiety are those behavioral components. So these, and in this, I've focused really on the way that anxiety often shows up in youth in particular. Behaviors that we often see when our youth are feeling anxious, I'll just highlight, it can look all the way from, it's very clear this person is anxious, this youth is anxious, they're saying, please don't leave me, something bad is going to happen, all the way to they are being highly irritable, lashing out, behavior problems. I'll put a note here that while it's not a core component of anxiety, we often do see those body-focused repetitive behaviors show up alongside anxious emotions. So this might be things like hair pulling, skin picking, nail biting, chewing on our lip or the inside of our mouth. A lot of the cognitive components of anxiety. So what are the thoughts that we're having? Often with OCD, this is going to be a lot of underlying belief of I cannot tolerate being uncertain, or I cannot tolerate feeling this way, and I have to change this experience of uncertainty. So we're going to hear a lot of predicting the worst, catastrophizing, telling ourselves that we know what other people are thinking or what's going to happen. And then in terms of the emotional or how it shows up, often especially in youth anxiety, we're going to see a lot more somatic experiences. So a lot more headaches, belly aches, um, difficulty with sleeping, restlessness, difficulty focusing. It can look like a different gamut. But these are kind of the main components that we all might be familiar with. So avoidance. Big appealing factor when we're feeling anxious. So the important to understand here is that when we are moving towards something that makes us feel anxious, it is very normal, natural to have the urge to move away from the thing that is causing the fear. Really helpful when that thing is actually a threat to our physical safety. Not so helpful in the context of a anxiety disorder or OCD. So the problem within that context is that we feel anxious about the situation. Let's say I'm really anxious about touching this thing that I believe if I touch it is going to get me sick and then cause me to get lots of other people sick. So I avoid touching it. Oof, that hit of relief feels really good. The problem with that is that the next time I'm faced with trying to move towards touching that thing, it is going to produce more anxiety and make it that much harder for me to act opposite to that urge to avoid. So, kind of key thing to understand here is that while avoidance is totally understandable, why we'd have the urge to avoid, it very rapidly makes anxiety and anxiety disorders worse. And it's important to know here that avoidance can look a lot of different ways. So it's, I recognize I often refer to like one presentation of OCD, right, which might be focused on contamination. But honestly, that's the least common type of OCD I've gotten to treat. And the thing I love about OCD is that it's just so there's so many different variations and flavors, and so often it's not we can't visibly see someone physically avoiding something, right? So avoidance is sneaky. It might look like actually avoiding people, places, certain situations, but it's often about avoiding feeling uncertain or feeling out of control. So when I am insisting on knowing something for sure, I am insisting on figuring something out, I am insisting that you have to guarantee me something, I am actually trying to avoid feeling out of control or feeling certain. Right, so avoidance might look like me excessively checking, engaging in compulsive rituals, trying to avoid thinking about something, um, or asking for extensive amounts of reassurance, right? I'm trying to avoid feeling uncertain about whether or not this person is mad at me. So, in the context of space, the rationale for space is that fear is kind of a unique emotion in that it is a very hardwired social emotion. So, this is really adaptive. So, young mammals of all species, when they experience fear, they activate, right? In young kids, this often looks like screaming, crying. This activates the fear response in their caregivers, which tells them, those caregivers, to hurry up and come protect their youth. It's a really adaptive feature that has helped us keep humans going because humans, when they're first born, are really useless and helpless. This feature is hardwired into caregivers to come to the defense of their young. However, this is not so helpful when we have a youth who has a chronically overactive fear response, right? So when we have a youth with an anxiety disorder or OCD, they're sending off that alarm bell because their own alarm bell system is kind of overactive, right? Which means that as a caregiver, our social signaling system is kind of permanently going off. We're hearing that alarm bell, um, and that is very taxing. So what typically happens for caregivers of individuals with OCD or anxiety is that it very quickly starts to impact our own personal boundaries as parents. Right? This might be everything from our physical boundaries, whether how physically close we are to our children or our youth, whether we're allowing them to sleep in our rooms, how much of our emotional time and energy is spent addressing our child's OCD, addressing their emotions, how much of our physical time is spent dealing with the implications of their OCD. Often it impacts the things that we do or say. And it's very easy for caregivers to slowly feel like their child's OCD is impacting kind of all domains of their lives. This unfortunately is really normative. And so the idea behind space is that we are going to be focusing on what caregivers have control of and accepting what we don't have control over, which I'll say is kind of refreshing in the sense that it's actually the same thing that all other caregivers are faced with. Like, we have only control over ourselves as caregivers, our behaviors, what we do and don't do as caregivers. We have no control over our youth's behavior, what they do or don't do, what they feel or don't feel, what they feel motivated to do or don't feel motivated to do. And so in space, we take um, kind of a good snapshot of what do we have control over as caregivers, and then we take active steps to make decisions about our behavior. And the idea here is that we can make unilateral decisions, meaning I think especially in our culture, we really prefer to be collaborative, to decide we're going to do something with our youth and all move forward together. But the idea here is in space is that I don't need my youth's approval because I'm not asking my youth to do anything. I'm going to be making decisions about how I'm going to act or not act as a caregiver. Um, and then tolerating the understandable emotions my youth might have about my behavior. And another thing we focus on in space is tolerating our youth's distress with the goal of building resilient youth, right? Like, think about it, many children would probably never get vaccines or shots if we left it up to them and what they felt motivated to do. And so we kind of take a similar approach here, thinking about I get to control my side of the street. So, the first kind of step in space is that we really help caregivers understand the very normal and common responses that caregivers can have to youth anxiety disorders. So, these are kind of the extremes, and all caregivers fall somewhere along the spectrum. But as one side of the spectrum is the overprotective side. So this is parenting out of kind of beliefs like my child can't handle this, being this anxious is going to traumatize them, it's my job to protect them, right? So it's easy to understand why we might get here. But I'm curious, does anyone have any thoughts? If you're willing, feel free to unmute. Like, why do you think it's so tempting to parent from the overprotective side? What makes sense or feels good about this?
I'll throw one out there.
Okay.
Uh, we want to keep our kids safe and okay and make sure everything is all right. And yeah, we don't want to have them deal with painful stuff.
Absolutely, right? Like, we're literally hardwired to protect our youth, right? It's in our natural wiring when they're in distress to want to protect them from that. So it's kind of our natural urge. Um, it also makes often our lives move a lot more smoothly when we step in and reduce the distress that they're feeling. So it's very understandable. On the other side of the spectrum, we can engage in what we call over-demanding responses to youth anxiety. So these are parenting behaviors driven by things sort of like, it's not that scary, you're being ridiculous, like she's just doing this for attention, or you should be able to do this at your age. Why does this response make sense? What do people think is understandable or could get parents parenting from an over-demanding place?
because oftentimes the obsessive fear can seem really irrational and
Totally.
yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh, absolutely. I would say more often than not, it feels for the person who doesn't have OCD completely irrational, right? Absolutely. Um, our own emotions, right? Often the OCD is interfering in we got to get out the door, or we're trying to have a nice family experience, or we're out in public, right? Um, it is often getting in the way of an like a goal that we're trying to accomplish. Um, it can also be really frightening as a caregiver to think like, oh my gosh, well, if you're feeling this anxious or afraid of this thing, like what's your future going to hold, right? We can get very fearful and push out of our fear for our child's well-being. So both sets of these responses are totally understandable, natural, and normative. And we know that in the extreme, neither response is very productive or helpful. And it's also very normal for youth with multiple caregivers to have caregivers that if one starts heading in one direction, for the other caregiver to feel like they have to balance the scale by stepping into the other direction, which can create a lot of conflict between caregivers. It's also very normative for caregivers themselves to swing back and forth, right? So I might largely be on the overprotection side, but I'm feeling rushed and really hungry, and I might come out pretty over demanding, right? Or I might largely be over demanding and then feel really guilty about it and swing to the other side. So, one of the first goals of space training is to teach parents how to embody this supportive middle. So the supportive response is one where we communicate that we accept and like understand our child's emotion. We're not validating the content of their emotion, meaning, oh my gosh, you are right. You probably are, going to cause World War III, or you probably are hated by everyone at school. Um, we're not going to validate the content, but we're going to validate the context of the emotion, meaning like it makes complete sense to not want to go to school when you believe something bad is going to happen, right? Like, or it's really hard to do things when we're feeling very scared, right? We can validate the experience of the emotion or even the urge to move away from or avoid things that make us anxious without validating the content, which we're not going to say, quite honestly, is valid. We can combine that acceptance of our child's emotion or validation with an and, not a but. This is my DBT side coming out strong against the but, because a lot of people feel like everything before the but goes out the window. Like if you say, it makes total sense that you're anxious, but you need to go, it's like, you're just saying that to get me out the door. So it's a really little tweak. It won't matter to everyone, but it matters to those who are more sensitive. So we want to validate our child's emotion or our loved one's emotion. I'll say a lot of what you learn in space, in my opinion, could be equally well applied to a spouse or other family member. These patterns don't feel, to me, terribly unique to parent and child. We're going to combine that with communication in our belief that our loved one or our child has the ability to do really hard things, has the ability to tolerate slightly more distress than they have before. We are not trying to convince our loved one of this. We are not trying to get them to agree with this. We are simply stating that we understand their emotion and we believe they can do really hard things in the face of it. So some examples of how we can move out of kind of these over demanding or overprotective responses. So instead of it's not frightening, right? We might say something like, it's so hard to do things that scare us, and I know you can tolerate that feeling. So one thing I'll just highlight is that on the belief in our child's ability to tolerate slightly more anxiety, I am not guaranteeing anything. I'm not saying, and I know if you just go to school, you'll have a great day. Or, and I know if you touch this thing, you won't get sick. Because one, I can't predict the future. And two, I actually don't want to give my child or loved one any false sense of certainty. I have no idea, right? And we actually want our youth to learn, like, they can do things without that certainty. So I might highlight here things like, I know you can tolerate that feeling, right? Or she just can't handle the stress. Well, I'm going to switch it. And I highlight this, is that it's important how we talk about our youth to other people. If I am constantly talking about my youth in a really overprotective way, like she can't handle it, she's not strong enough, she's not going to be able to do, like, manage these things, it's very hard for that not to come out in front of our children. And so it might switch to, it's hard for her and she can manage hard things, right? Or I need to protect him goes to, it's my job to support him while preparing him to deal with challenges in life. So common supportive statements are that I would recommend are things like, I see how hard it is for you to move to do this when you're feeling this anxious, and I believe you are incredibly strong. Or it makes complete sense that you wouldn't want to feel uncertain about how I feel about you, and I know you can cope with that feeling. Right? So I'm really just trying to acknowledge what makes sense or is understandable about the person's emotion, or just name, like, that we see their emotion, and communicate, and the idea that they can do things even with that emotion still present. Because this is another trap I think I see a lot of caregivers fall into, is falling into this trap of, like, I somehow have to get your anxiety down before either of us can expect you to be able to do the thing. And you're not going to be able to do it. Neither can I. Right. So in space, the first kind of step is that we're learning how to make supportive statements, and we start implementing them. And I will say, I didn't at first really get these, because I was like, well, we're simply just telling youth what we believe to be true. We're not, if your youth is like, nope, I can't do this, or I'm not strong, I am dropping the rope. I'm saying, like, yeah, you agree to disagree. I'm simply letting you know how I feel. This isn't a debate, and I don't have to debate it. I have been shocked to see how many youth's behaviors have changed with nothing other than supportive statements. Because if you are constantly hearing these types of messaging, like, your caregivers, your external monologue becomes your child's internal monologue. So this is one of the best ways to kind of sow the seeds of, I can do things even when I feel really anxious, or I can do things even when I feel uncertain. So that's the first half. The next big focus of space is on recognizing and reducing accommodation behaviors. So for our purposes, accommodation is defined as behaviors that we as caregivers are doing or not doing because of our child's anxiety disorder or OCD in the absence of a real or serious threat. Right? So this is going to depend on our child's age or developmental level. Right? Holding the hand of a youth to cross the street, probably a totally normative, appropriate behavior for a 5-year-old, probably an inappropriate accommodation behavior for a 15-year-old who's worried they're going to lose control and run into traffic. Right? Accommodation, good ways to recognize that an accommodation behavior is present is it's often disruptive to our lives. It feels time consuming. It takes up our time or energy. It's not how we would otherwise wish to parent, right? If we have other youth, it's not what we would do with them. It's not, we don't necessarily enjoy it. Often it feels like we're kind of giving in or participating in our child's anxiety disorder or OCD. So here are some common examples of accommodation behaviors. I tried to tweak them a bit to be more OCD focused. But as you can imagine, this shows up across all types of anxiety. So accommodation behaviors might be me participating, right? Like I'm engaging in, I wash my hands just how my youth wants me to, multiple times, or I go and check things for them, right? Or I engage in their very rigid or extensive nighttime rituals. So it might be I'm participating, or I'm helping them avoid things. So I might take away any expectation that they go places that prompt their OCD distress, or stop going places as a family because they feel distressed out in public. I might engage in a lot of reassurance. So giving reassurance about things I actually can't guarantee, like what's going to happen in the future, or vague things that are, in my opinion, like judgments. Like I don't actually believe anyone's good or bad. And I don't get to declare, though, that you are officially good or bad, right? Giving that false sense of certainty. It might be like materials. I'm buying extra soap. I'm asking other people to not, um, I'm preventing you from experiencing the natural consequences of your OCD. So let's say I have a youth who is engaging in a ton of compulsions over and over that are making it hard to get from class to class at school. Well, me asking the school to not have any consequences for my youth being late to class because they're engaging in OCD compulsions is actually preventing a consequence that could motivate my youth to see, like, man, doing this, like engaging with my OCD is really getting in my way. So these are just some examples of ways that we can engage in accommodation as a caregiver. And this is a completely normative cycle. So our youth has distress related to their OCD. The family or the caregiver gets pulled into doing something to reduce the distress, to preventing it in the first place. Everyone, I want to highlight, everyone feels better, right? Now, the youth is calmer. I feel less on edge or anxious as a caregiver. The problem with this is that it maintains my youth's dependence on me to continue this behavior, to regulate or manage my OCD, which keeps it going and quite often builds my OCD. And so the problem with accommodation is, one, it's completely the norm. So if you are a caregiver with a youth with OCD or anxiety, I will guarantee you there's almost no way that you are not engaging in any form of accommodation, just because that is the norm. But the problem with doing it is that it's associated with more severe anxiety symptoms. And the more that we do it, the more impairment it creates for our children and for our families, right? And it's easier to see, like, it when we start accommodating, we quickly stop often doing things like sleeping alone, going to school, going out into the world. One of the biggest things I will highlight as a provider who works directly with a lot of youth and adults is that, why on earth would I have motivation to do really hard things in treatment if I can avoid my anxiety by getting the world around me to accommodate? So accommodation is a really poor predictor of treatment outcomes. And it's interesting, not just in like behavioral, like CBT, exposure treatments, but also in medication. Um, and it often creates secondary or tertiary problems like sleep. So convinced you we don't want to be doing it. Before you leave here and just pull the rug out from anyone, the goal with SPACE, the kind of the 30,000 foot view of the SPACE program, is that we make a really detailed map of all the accommodation that's happening currently. We decide on one that we're going to target, the very first one that we're going to target. We craft a really thought out plan for how we're going to remove this accommodation. We then formally announce our plan to change our behavior to our youth in a formal announcement that I'll talk a little bit more about. And then we implement our new plan, just having removed that single accommodation. And we kind of give everyone time for the dust to settle. I will say sometimes families hem and haw about this, and their youth is like, okay, and there's literally nothing. They're like, why have I been doing this for the past 6 months? Other times all the fears come true and it is rough. And so we give whatever amount of time we need to kind of readjust, and then we start all over again. And so the goal of space is that you, as a caregiver, learn the principles of how to recognize and then remove an accommodation. And I often, if I have a care family who's, got 30 items on their accommodation list, I might lead them through removing the first couple, and then they are kind of off to the races on their own. Another thing I'll say is that often once we remove a couple, youth kind of stop expecting as much accommodation. And often we don't have to go through the formal process of removing the rest. It kind of starts to die down more naturally. So I think it's easier to understand, like this is an example of a final plan that caregivers might have come up with. So for example, this is a situation where caregivers have been engaging in this really extensive, detailed goodnight ritual that required both parents and had to be restarted if it was messed up. And it was, and I think this is such a good example in the sense that this is a pretty normative child behavior for young kids to, want a certain goodnight kiss, but it can easily become like it just slowly creeps up and slowly. Now it's like a 20-minute, 30-minute shebang that has to be redone. And so a plan is for the caregivers, meaning we've decided ahead of time what is the caregiver going to do and what are they not going to do. So this family decided one parent would say goodnight to the child in bed, the other would say goodnight in the living room. The parent would leave the room immediately after saying goodnight. The parent would return after 20 minutes if the child was still awake or in distress, but not do the ritual and provide a supportive statement. We're planning for how we're going to respond to various youth behaviors. A plan does not involve what the kid is going to do. The plan involves how we're going to respond to various behaviors that our loved one might do, right? So if the youth acted out, we decided that the parents were not going to punish this unless there was physical aggression. Decided in advance how caregivers were going to reinforce any step in the direction of the youth, falling asleep without the ritual. And we came up with like troubleshooting our backup plans, right? So if the youth was really dysregulated for a long period of time, we came up with a backup plan of, we're going to call in space. We call this a supporter. And we talk about how do we bring in supporters to help strengthen our system to kind of beat back OCD. And in this situation, family planned to bring in an aunt the next night in the home to stay. So parents could leave the house after staying goodnight. And this is part of the idea for this is that very often youth with OCD or anxiety disorders are a lot less likely to ramp it up as much with people they're slightly less comfortable with. And that's kind of just a broad, we all are on our worst behavior with the people we feel most comfortable with. And so the idea is like, we're going to use the aunt as a step down. So often we have to do a lot of common troubleshooting. We got to do troubleshooting for these plans, right? So often caregivers might be worried, like, if we don't do this, our youth is not going to eat or not going to sleep or not going to go to school. This is why, these are broad principles, but we do have to work, every family is different. So for some youth, not eating for a couple days or a week, is not going to create a medical emergency. And for some youth, this is not an acceptable option. And we have to do a lot more troubleshooting around that. But common solutions are like, one, we can always enact a plan first just on the weekend or just after school so that we're not messing with getting everyone out the door. For example, we often wait and start certain plans on a holiday vacation. We're planning for when can the system tolerate some more shakeup. It's sort of like planning to go through potty training or sleep training, right? Like, let's plan for this to maybe be rocky for a little bit. We plan for what are our backup plans for if our youth, decides they're not leaving the house or they're not getting in the car. we want to make sure that we have solutions that don't just force the caregiver back into the accommodation behavior. So for example, if the youth refuses to get on the bus to come home from school because what they want is the parent to come get them, we're identifying and getting in the buy-in of a supporter. That might be a friend, a neighbor, a babysitter, a family member that is going to come and bring them home, right? We have to think these through ahead of time so that we can execute this. Because the goal here is once we've enacted our plan, we really want to show our youth that like we're sticking to our plan, regardless of kind of your different behaviors that might show up. Sometimes we have to get quite creative here. So once we've come up with a plan, we communicate this to our youth in a written announcement. Often families are like, what? That sounds really awkward and formal. And it's kind of meant to be. So we want this to feel different to our youth. We want this to be clear. We've thought a lot about this. We're not just saying this out of emotion. It also, by writing it down, we ensure that we say exactly what we mean and we kind of don't back off because we see tears coming out of our child's eyes. It holds us more accountable. If I give my youth a letter about what I'm going to do starting Monday, it makes it a lot more awkward if I don't do that on Monday. And the idea here is that we are simply telling our youth about what they can expect from us, and we owe it to them to inform them that change is happening and also why. So I have included this very wordy slide here, but this is an example announcement. It's a real one, obviously names changed, from a family I worked with, and I'll just give folks a couple minutes to read through it. All right. Any thoughts on what stands out to you about this? What kind of is being communicated here, or what are the emotions that you know? Yeah, please just unmute yourself.
Okay, I will. I think one of the most important things that is conveyed is that like we're a team, like we'll conquer this together. Like we know you want this to change. We're on your side. Like this is us doing our part to support you,
Yes.
rather than like an us versus you mentality. And I think that's super crucial.
Yes. Yeah. And I loved this letter because I feel like it captured that so well, which is this idea that like space is not about like punishing someone because they have OCD, but is like we are going to parent for our child, not for our child's OCD. Like we are on team you and we are not on team OCD, and we can understand why it might not feel good. And it's sort of like underneath our loved one's OCD, we know that our loved one has a desire to not being ruled by their disorder. And so we are parenting to support that loved one. So we walk parents through one, shaping this announcement and then delivering that announcement. So we plan for how to deliver that announcement and how to handle various responses that we can get. And in some the reason we teach the principles of space, but then work with different families to differing degrees, because in some circumstances we have a lot of things that we have to problem solve in terms of all the different challenging responses that might show up. And I will say we can work with them. We have I have seen space work in really challenging circumstances where we had to navigate a lot of threats for actual physical aggression, self-harm, suicidality, and we can work through that. So one of the last things, this isn't a core part of space, but something I weave in, again, kind of from my DBT background, is really helping caregivers understand what they do have control over and what they do not have control over. And really empowering parents to focus on what they do have the ability to control, and validating, but saying like, I'm going to let go of the fact that, maybe my youth does not feel motivated or is unwilling to change their behavior around OCD right now, or is not willing or motivated to engage in treatment for their OCD. Right? I might have a lot of feelings about that. But what I do get to control is, right, how easy or hard I make it for them to avoid things that prompt their anxiety, how I incentivize them to approach things, how I let them experience the natural consequences of their avoidance. I will say it's probably one of the biggest things I'm working with families to help them do is let the OCD burn, feel like let our loved ones feel the burn of their OCD. And that's really hard to do as a caregiver. So just some thoughts or ways that if you're interested in learning more about space that you can learn more. So there's a caregiver book that is designed to kind of walk caregivers through the general principles of space by one of the creators of space, Eli Leibowitz, and it's called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. So as Ben mentioned, I'm at the TAP clinic and I have created a virtual learning course that walks caregivers through the core components of space with the idea that then as you go through that, you can schedule individually with a space provider as much or as little, because again, families really vary in the severity of what's going on and how much they need help personalizing it. So you're more than welcome to learn more about that through by contacting our clinic. You can also visit spacetreatment.net to learn all about space treatment, to read the research behind it, and there's also a roster of trained clinicians there. And I'll open it up to questions, but feel free also, this is my email, and you're welcome to shoot me an email if you have any questions after tonight.